Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Zahi Zalloua, a Cushing Eells Professor of Philosophy and Literature and Director of Indigeneity, Race, Ethnicity Studies at Whitman College. He is also editor of The Comparatist. His teaching and scholarship engage critical Black studies, the post-human, and the Palestinian question. His most recent works include Fanon, Zizek, and the Violence of Resistance, The Politics of the Wretched, Race, Reason, and Ressentiment, Solidarity and the Palestinian Cause, Indigeneity, Blackness, and the Promise of Universality, among many other books. I welcome Zahi Zalloua to Savage Minds. When I read your wonderful essay titled Unlearning Zionism in Philosophical Salon, you took up one of my subjects of preference, which is Edward Said's work on Orientalism, wherein he refers to Raymond Williams. And you write, if Orientalism stimulates a new kind of dealing with the Orient, indeed it eliminates the Orient and Occident altogether, then we shall have advanced a little in the process of what Raymond Williams has called unlearning of the inherent dominative mode. Unlearning Orientalism, exposing and dismantling its racist grammar, is tantamount to destroying the meanings of Occident and Orient, since the East is at its core nothing more than a phantasmatic projection of the West. I really love this, and I'm going to read the last sentence. Unlearning as a critical pedagogical practice holds the promise of liberating us from ontological segregations and the most persistent of binarisms, that of the civilized European and the savage non-European. And from here, in your essay, you go into a critique of Zionism, which, as you say, on the many challenges of unlearning Zionism in fascist times. And so, as you are well aware, American and Canadian media have been awash in Hasbara in the last 2 years, but even before. And we have seen this in recent days, where Hasbara has again crept into legacy media, where we were told of the interception of the flotilla and not kidnapping of people, because that's what would have been called had Hamas or any other group done that. And then the language framing the subject's guilt, such as prisoners being exchanged for hostages, right?
Exactly.
So the prisoner is ipso facto guilty because everyone knows, wink, wink, that all prisoners are guilty and all hostages are innocent. Okay, so there we go, the thinking. So I'm wondering if you could, for our listeners, discuss, in fact, the valuable work of Edward Said and where it can be employed today.
Absolutely. And Said drew attention to the mechanisms of Zionism, how, in a sense, it creates a horizon that fixes the meaning of being Jewish, being Palestinian, and Palestinian has been on the worst end of it, insofar as Palestinian is always the negation of whatever Zionism stands for: civilization, mastery, sovereignty, rationality. And Palestinians are the excess, hateful with no real purpose, so fundamentally anti-Semitic, somebody with whom you can't forge peace. So Zionism, from the standpoint of its victim, has been very influential to me. Part of my engagement with Said has also been on his vision of Zionism as something that has to be understood. And for years, I've committed to this. And in that spirit, I work on Jacqueline Rose, The Question of Zion, which is very much influenced by Said, The Question of Palestine. But I'm becoming more and more critical of an attempt to understand Zionism and just stop there, right? In essence, one can get lost in Zionism. And then you can coin the term Zionisms in the plural, which then signals to the person like, oh, I am intelligent. I'm aware of all these diverse genealogies: cultural Zionism, secular Zionism versus messianic, religious, political Zionism. I think today, that gesture of Zionisms in the plural is the ideological move par excellence, right? In a sense, it distracts us from actually existing Zionism, which is where my work is heading right now. I think it's consistent with Said. I think Said today would see Zionism as having, in a sense, defined itself through its genocide of Palestinians through its engagement in a brutal devastation of Palestinian sociality. But Said himself, when he was asked directly in one of his last interviews, should Israeli Jews de-Zionize? He pushed back, says, no, I refuse to impose something like this on any individual. He thought it was too apocalyptic, like, ontological upheavals are never good. He imagined a kind of measured transformation among Israeli Jews. In a sense, they would move from a belligerent sovereignty to a model of coexistence with the other. And this would be a gradual move. I think today we have to call for a kind of ontological upheaval. We have to compel Zionists to engage in a kind of self-violence, a kind of symbolic suicide in the name of a just cause, in the name of a Palestinian justice in the region. I think now the gesture to just understand Zionism is no longer working. I think you still have to understand Zionism's appeal, right? A place for safety for Jews, a place of refuge for Jews who have been systematically persecuted, historically reaching its high point in the Holocaust. But now we have to look at what Zionists are doing and what they're rationalizing, and it's unacceptable. So, Jacqueline Rose still, right, in her book, The Question of Zion, and she's been attacked viciously by Zionists. She says, Zionism shouldn't be understood as an insult or a dirty word. I think I say this in my essay. I think now we have to say it is an insult. It is a dirty word. It is a supremacist ideology that is rationalizing genocide.
I agree. In fact, I had David Miller on the show recently, who was fired for basically a lecture he gave in 2019, wherein he drew a link between Zionism and Islamophobia. And I find it quite interesting that today we are more free. Generally speaking, we can speak more freely about the racism within Zionism historically. It's provable. It's not like we're making this up. Yeah. And the pushback, there was the pushback from many Americans in that infamous Philadelphia conference in, I believe, the 1894-ish, where they refused the notion of a Jewish state. Many people recognized way back that this was problematic and even racist. So what we have on the one hand, you've tuned in, I'm sure, a few times to see the Piers Morgan daily, do you condone Hamas? Yes or no? And that's the litmus test. But there's another litmus test, perhaps, that he forgot, which was that of, in fact, Zionism, and the same link that David Miller makes, that many of us have witnessed, even living there, seeing this direct link between the belief in an ethno-supremacist state and the aftermath or its aftermath and what has happened since 1948 to Palestinians. Because what we're seeing is, I was speaking to a friend earlier today, and she says, she made a reference to, I don't agree with you about Israel. I think that the state of Israel should exist. And it's interesting she said that. And I said, well, I never said it shouldn't exist, just for the record. But I think that a lot of people, and phenomenally, I'm American as well, you see the Zionist lobby in the US, which one would assume is much better funded and much stronger. But on paper, there was a survey last week that had an alarmingly, it was something like 64% of American Jews disagreed with a Jewish state. But in the UK, Zionism is full on. And it's not just the right wing, it's the New Statesman and Guardian reader, right? It's a very different demographic. I have often wondered this, Zahi. Several questions I've wondered. Is there historical guilt afoot here with the British posturing to be seen as supporting Zionism? And they're mostly not Jews, by the way, right? These are British Anglicans or agnostics who support this state. And on the other hand, they believe, I think very wrongly, that criticizing, because this falls into the problem of what Zionism means and the recent redefinition of the IHRA, right, which has become this bugaboo term where now the bar is far higher to being an anti-Semite, or I should say lower, in the sense that anyone can be an anti-Semite, because just criticizing Netanyahu, oh, we knew you were anti-Semitic, right? So I think that there's an aporia between what people understand to be Zionism. Many people don't realize its racist origins and its racist ideology even today. And then this shifting of the goalpost by the new definition that many universities across the US and the UK have adopted. And then along with this adhesion to what anti-Zionism is or anti-Semitism is, because those are supposed to be the same when they're not, you have also this problem of what people understand when they look at the events of the past 2 years, what most people are calling a genocide, which most human rights organizations and legal scholars in genocide are calling a genocide. And even then, many people, myself included, have made the argument that the genocide did not begin 2 years ago. Right? Could you discuss this kind of problem where Zionism and that, again, the bugaboo word of Zionism, which gets you caught in that trap of, I knew you were an anti-Semite, and then the inability that breeds to not being able to discuss the human rights of people that are even now in the aftermath of this alleged peace deal and ceasefire are still being killed?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I mean, these are great questions. Maybe I'll begin with your first comment about, how you get trapped about you don't believe in Israel's right to exist. That itself is a very abstract formulation. Does any nation have a right to exist? Nations are historical creations. So even the idea of a right to exist for a nation state seems odd. But let's move beyond that. What most people who object to Israel are objecting to a fascist state existing. No supremacist state should exist. I think anybody who has, a tendency towards anti-fascism, anti-racism would support that thesis, right? So qualifying what we mean by, a critique of a Zionist Israel, it's a critique of a supremacist state. It's a critique of a state that has a kind of racial matrix of the human, where it puts Ashkenazi Jews, European Jews at the top, Mizrahi Jews, Arab Jews, Jews from Muslim countries second. Then, of course, Ethiopian Jews, right? The anti-blackness dominates Israeli society. And then at the bottom of the bottom, right, you may have actually, the Arab citizens of Israel, because Israeli government refused to call them Palestinian citizens of Israel, right? There's a kind of linguistic erasure here that just always sets the conditions for the full ontological erasure. And then in the occupied territories and abroad, you have just Palestinians who are less than nothing. So this is the racial hierarchy of Israel. It's not simply an ethno-state. It is an ethno-state, but it's also, there's a racial logic at work at the heart of the Zionist project, which is basically, right, a colonial project. It reproduces European racism in the Middle East. So there's that element of Zionism. And it still has purchase. I think, the question of guilt is undeniable. Europe's attempt to overcome its horrors, what it allowed to happen on its soil, is then, solved through the creation of Israel. And, where Palestinians become, get the hell that, the byproduct of creating a state on their land and their dispossession, they're paying the price for European guilt. And, it's tragic. And, so when Aimé Césaire looks at why is Europe so invested in the Holocaust, so invested in its crimes, or in that crime of crimes that is genocide, it's because they turned the machinery on its own people, right? I mean, so, Aimé Césaire points to slavery, points to colonialism. These were practices that Europe had no problem when Hitler was being done over there. When Hitler is done at home, becomes unacceptable. And I think Zionism taps into this. So, to accuse to accuse Israel of genocide is to remind Europe of its failed investment in a state. All right. And now I think they're just too deep into the commitment to Israel to walk it back, because I mean they're complicit with genocide. You have Trump trying to posture for the Nobel Prize, and I think he should get it, but he should pick it up at The Hague.
It was very much the case of too little, too late. We cannot lay this at his feet. As most of our listeners will know, this is the love affair that the U.S. has in Israel dated back to the 1960s. And this deserves scrutiny, but certainly I'm not a big fan of making Trump the boogeyman in all this, because Biden let the worst of it happen and the dearth of it.
Absolutely. And thank you for saying this, because this is precisely this is how Zionism survives, or is trying to survive. Because in a sense, you do make the boogeyman Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and Netanyahu, and you give life to the liberal Zionist position. That position should no longer be credible, should no longer be maintained. For this reason, we have to have a kind of systematic critique of both parties in the United States, not just the right-wingers. And before Biden, you had Obama, right? When Obama was running against Hillary Clinton for the presidency, Obama had said, nobody has suffered more than the Palestinian people. And people were like freaking out around him. Like, this is such a rookie mistake. And Hillary Clinton was loving it, because now she can show that, you have to understand that how America's devotion is towards Israel, not towards the Palestinians. So he did walk it back. He just finished the thought. Nobody has suffered more than the Palestinian people because of their own government, their own leaders. So Palestinians are victims of Palestinians. And this, for me, captures the Zionist lens.
This has been going on even before, Oslo, right? And then last week, when the peace deal was made and everyone was the week before happy about what happened at the UN. I was happy what happened at the UN, but it was a ribbon on a package that was destroyed. The time for recognizing the state of Palestine was back around Oslo.
Yeah.
And of course, what we've witnessed the past 2 years has been a constant barrage of the reality on our screens and smartphones, but also the situation is not only dire, it's a lesson it's almost as if Orientalism had never been written.
Absolutely.
Oh, we had a huge pushback from a lot of our readers who paradoxically were following us on our work, criticizing gender ideological movements that were undoing women's rights, and they were fine with that. But the undoing of Palestinian rights, no, that was a line too far.
Yeah.
And I thought, but both are based in material reality.
Sure.
Your argument, I'm telling the feminists, your argument is that women don't have penises. Okay, that's pretty much a scientific fact. And then we're saying over here, there's a genocide that's in motion, but is now going on full force. And they do not accept it. So this leads me to this problem of the current political situation and the situation on the ground in Gaza, which is quite dire. The situation in the West Bank is coming more and more, however, to resemble that of Gaza pre-2023. And so while much of the planet has protested these grotesque human rights violations, a genocide which is still not pronounced by many parliaments and senates, where corporate media still skirts around the enormity of Israel having wiped out Palestinian journalists, medics, destroyed hospitals, starved a population literally to death, while TV hosts on MSNBC and Fox News alike find new euphemisms for genocide because even they know if they say the G word, their careers are over. Yeah. So all this is going on. And I ask you, what do you have to say to feminists screaming at me on Twitter, accusing me of being a rape apologist when I point out the reports about what happened on 7 October 2023 and the mere impossibility of the Hamas fighters being able to paraglide in and then rape here and there and then go back, reading the reports. We're having Reem Aslam on the show very soon. It's like facts don't matter.
Yeah.
Of course, the male violence, the repeated narrative of, well, men rape in war, so it must have happened. And I'm like, that's a logical fallacy. So what do you have to say to those who claim offense that Israel would dare be accused of genocide, or those who state the following? Some of the quotes I've received on X. So there you go. It's official. Gaza is the first genocide in human history where the population has increased. And then this one, did you watch the video footage of the release? There are so many fat people in Gaza, nobody blockaded aid. And some of these feminists I've just referred to, one of them wrote, they don't need food, they need a treadmill. You know, you've seen the comments.
Yeah.
They're grotesque. They're basically not very human at all. And so social media has been awash in that. On top of this, people say, well, Gaza, the Palestinians, of course, they exaggerate the death toll. And I say to them, excuse me, but the Gaza Health Authority is the most conservative of all the reporting agencies out there. The Lancet in June of this year estimated the death toll of the genocide in Gaza at 186,000 people or more. And then there's even more data out there, projects with estimates far higher, such as Skewering History, the Odious Politics of Counting Gaza's Dead by Dr. Richard Hill and Gideon Polya, who claim that the number of dead as of April this year stood at 680,000. Okay?
Yeah.
They did modeling. How to address facts to certain members of the public who say things like what I just read, or things like Israel has a right to exist. And paradoxically, you know, the funny thing is these very same feminists get really charged up when they've got trans activists saying, we have a right to exist. You're saying that lesbians don't have penises. It's an encroachment on my existence. And they say, well, you exist. We're not saying you don't exist. We have another argument with you. Yet they fall into that same trap.
Absolutely.
Of the female penis, but with Palestine. I know, what a weird paradox, but it is.
Yeah. I mean, where to begin? I mean, these kind of social media posts have been horrendous. Aside from the IOF soldiers putting, picturing themselves, making fun of Palestinians, imagining them faking their injuries, celebrating building, destroying buildings. It's obscene across the board. And I mean, we have to look at it kind of, ideologically. What happened in the first week of following October 7th? You had the beheading of babies. So, things that could trigger massive kind of repulsion on the large scale, on the global scale. So you had that narrative, and you had Biden saying, I've seen the images. No, idiot, you haven't seen anything, right? All this is a discourse that sees the mind of the West, guided them towards one image of Hamas as pure evil. And discourses about systematic rape itself has been debunked. On this point, I'm not a purist. Rapes could have happened. Hamas opened up the gates, other people went through the gates, but there is no coordination. There's no proof there was a coordination of a systematic rape of women. I think that there is a good case for that. And, it taps into this kind of racist fantasy of, the black rapist that has plagued disputes within feminist communities. At the height of the MeToo movement, white women were surprised that black women were like resisting. Women had accused our brothers, our husbands, our fathers of rape, right? Wrongly accused them of rape. So don't just ask us to believe you, right? Without any proof, because this has been weaponized against people of color historically. And, we're almost reliving, June Jordan's resistance to her feminist group, including Audre Lorde, and their defense, their shielding of, Zionist feminists who are attached to Israel. I think rereading June Jordan at this moment is wonderful for feminists to learn about this transnational solidarity with the question of Palestine, how feminism is interested in Palestine for these following reasons, right? Not just for a kind of identitarian politics.
And that plus the fact of, honestly, there's a genocide ongoing. And I do think you have to do a political triage. The hostages are being released these days.
Yeah.
If it comes out that women who've been kept hostage for 2 years, let's say they were to have been raped or one were to have been raped, honestly, it would not surprise me. Not because Palestinians are horrible rapists, but because, unfortunately, the feminists are correct when they say that rape is a historical fact
Yeah.
of much of war. That's true.
Yeah.
Just doesn't mean that every single time, et cetera, et cetera. And I find it really troubling that even the numbers of dead becomes an issue where they're pointing to the Gaza Health Authority's numbers, which is the most conservative, as I said earlier, and they are claiming that that's made up. And we've seen the buildings. We
Yeah.
know that
Yeah.
those pancaked buildings have dead bodies in them.
And I mean, let's not forget, the hundreds of thousands of maimed amputees, people who will not, how will they survive in Gaza? I mean, they've biologically survived, but how are they going to survive? And that is often ignored, right? The huge devastation that has happened to the Palestinian population. They have basically enacted their wish. They're going to make it unlivable. They shrunk Gaza, but life cannot grow in Gaza anymore, right? It will take tremendous amount of work. Even the rubble, they're saying it'll take for 2050 before all the rubble is removed because of the bombs that have not exploded. All these, I mean, it's right. Describing the mess fails to do justice to the harshness of the reality. But on the question of rape, you have Israeli politicians in the Knesset floor calling for more raping of Palestinians, prisoners. I mean, they're quoted, they're in print. The world doesn't care. I mean, since the world, you have here politicians advocating rape as a method of torture and punishment. But it doesn't matter because they're not human beings. And since you're raping non-humans, right? So people can look away. There's no outrage, right? And since they're terrorists, you can do whatever you want with them. So it's not genocide if you're killing terrorists. I mean, that's the logic, and that's the Zionist logic, right? In a sense, if you remove the humanity, if you anti-humanize Palestinians, then you can do whatever you want with them, right? You can torture them, you can subjugate them, you can displace them, and you can wipe them out. It's part of the same logic. So once you actually see them as devoid of life, anything is possible. So here, Franco Berardi has put it very nicely how, Israelis, Jews historically were the enemy, the antagonists of Europeans. Now they've joined the racist class. So they have the right to exterminate, they have the right to exploit. I think this is what we're seeing. And Europe is stepping back and looking like, okay, this is almost like watching an old film of colonial days. We used to do this. Israel is doing it. And, in my more pessimistic mode of thinking, Israel is almost like a thought experiment realize, right? Almost as a kind of dress rehearsal for future catastrophes. What can Israel get away with? Because, this will be helpful for us. What can we get away with when we have these kind of massive ecological disasters? And Israel tells you can get away with genocide for 2 years, no problem. Which is a lesson that should terrify all of us.
But yeah, that plus what they've done to neighboring countries
Absolutely.
and Iran, which is not exactly a neighboring country either.
And Macron was the first after Israel bombed Iran. Israel has a right to self-defense. In what world is bombing Iran self-defense here? I mean, it's maddening.
What's insane is how many people buy the lies. And I've been telling people for months, this is WND all over. They lied to us before. Come on, get in the queue. If you're going to get your bowl of porridge, at least acknowledge you've been in that queue before. This is really explicitly located within the Western mindset. Because when you talk to people from any country in Latin America, Africa, Asia, they know what's going on.
Absolutely.
They see it. They see that Israel can bomb Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, obviously Gaza, but Iran, and I'm forgetting one other area.
They go to the West Bank whenever they want. They don't care. You have settlers being, followed by IOF soldiers. So yeah, no, they bomb anything that moves.
And that's not the story that's told, however, because when you watch Christian Amanpour, and you're watching this Iranian British speaker who has this kind of authoritarian cadence, and she seems to know what she's talking about, but she has sterilized the narrative quite perfectly.
Absolutely.
And it's really troubling, because then again, feminists were a great audience for Netanyahu and company to plan on utilizing.
Yeah.
Because I've made a joke with someone recently that I could create a fake account on Twitter with a fake name, fake everything, and say, in this fake land that does not exist, I was raped by this fake group of people. And I said, I bet 100 feminists would have that retweeted within an hour.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of skepticism from many women, such as myself, who view this tarring for what it is. It's just a racial and a racist astroturfing of genocide. And they counted on feminists saying, oh my God, rape. And they don't read the report. They don't care. It's just rape. It had to happen because believe all women, right?
Yeah, and here, the image that comes to my mind is the vicious response to Judith Butler's commentary on Hamas and the accusation of rape, and their insistence that they want to see the evidence. So somebody like Eva Eells, who is a French-Israeli sociologist, went after Butler in such a nasty fashion that she made the link, like Butler was trafficking in lies, in snake oil was the expression that Eva Eells used, with gender trouble. So Butler's thinking on gender was bogus. Her, Eells' insistence, her vision that now Butler is lying about Hamas. So you have a direct link here between gender trouble and Butler's, pro-Palestinian position, right? Their anti-Zionist stance. And you see, like, the threat of any feminism that actually is responsible, feminism that is cognizant of how marginalization happens across the board. Now, I have my problems with Butler and their commitment to nonviolence as well, right? Because it at times it could come across as another version of white privilege, right? And it's not when nonviolence is an option, good for you. You can exercise it, but sometimes nonviolence can appear as a cruel demand.
Yes, as the wonderful Desmond Tutu once said, if you're a mouse and your tail is being stepped on by an elephant, the nonviolence will not be appreciated by that mouse. And this is the paradox. Of course, I don't agree with her work on gender whatsoever, but her strongest writing has been the post 9/11 book, brilliant. Yeah. Her work on violence has been excellent. So, and then of course, we all know how to have dialogues. Remember in the 90s when you could sit down and talk to people and disagree about some things, agree about others?
Sure.
That's the same thing. It hasn't changed. But somehow people have been siloized into this idea of, she said this, she is evil, I will not agree with anything else she says. And that has taken over in large part because of the way that social media has trained us to siloize ourselves and or begin sentences that begin like this. I don't agree with everything she says, but, and you hear people doing that a lot these days. But we're talking again about the genocide of people that could range anywhere from 70,000 up to 700,000, depending on what the actual facts will be named, I hope, one day.
Yeah. And I think, you raise the excellent point that genocide started well before this. People were talking about a slow genocide happening in Palestine, right? For decades, they were pointing it out. And in many ways, what Hamas's strike on October 7th is an attempt to say this cannot go on, right? The abuses in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, the caging of Gaza, right, for, getting close now to 20 years is unacceptable, right? So, I remember we have a very strong SGP chapter at Whitman, and I'm their advisor. I remember shortly after October 7th, we were rallying on campus. And, part of my, prepared remarks were, we can't settle for a return to October 6th. And at a cruel level, we're not back to October 6th. We're way worse than October 6th. Palestinians and Hamas is trying to negotiate what they had before October 7th. And this is where the left is now, this is where the anti-colonial is left now. We have to resist now the lures of liberals who are trying to produce this kind of nostalgia for a two-state solution, which is simply empty promises. Where you can see another 30 years of a fake peace process where settlements expand, where Gaza shrinks. This is the logic that Edward Said was criticizing the Oslo Accords before the ink had dried, because for him, any actual peace, any just peace, has to acknowledge the freedom, sovereignty, and equality of both parties, and this was not the case. The PLO, recognized Israel, right? It didn't recognize Israel as a Jewish state yet. That demand came later. But they recognized Israel as a state. They gave up on the kind of anti-colonial framework of resistance. What did the Palestinians get? The PLO recognizes, the Israel recognizes the PLO represents the Palestinian people. That's it. They got nothing. I mean, they got only a recognition of the Palestinian, the PLO as a stand-in for the Palestinian people. There's no commitment to Palestinian territory. So Said saw this, and 30 years later, the whole world saw Israel's systematic dispossession of Palestinians, no matter who was in power. Settlers expanded, right? So here, the settler is not just the illegal settler on Palestinian soil. Every Israeli Jew, in a sense, is a settler. Is an inner settler because, in a sense, you're accepting a vision de facto of a greater Israel, right? There's no real pressure to dismantle those illegal settlements, which hosts now with the illegal posts about 700,000 Israelis. And you hear this fear from people like Celia Ben Habib, oh, this will create potentially a civil war among Israelis if you dismantle all these settlements. So even in the peace plan, the settlements are accepted as facts on the ground, and you work around them. So at best right now, Palestinians get a Swiss cheese sovereignty, which is no sovereignty at all. So I think, what the labor of the anti-left, the anti-colonial left, should be here is resisting going back to October 6th and not settling for the carrots that liberals will try to produce. We're at a moment now where we're in the practice of setting the records for the future, for what Israel has done to the Palestinian people. And we cannot let Israel get away with genocide. And this is something that we have to repeat. We can't allow them to get away with genocide. We can't allow a war criminal like Netanyahu to go on with no accountability for his actions. It is unacceptable. So how do we exert pressure on Israel? How do we make Israel a pariah state, right? It is already a pariah state for a younger generation of activists, students, faculty. The global South has always considered Israel a pariah state. The global North is realizing this. Political leaders, folks in power, are resisting, right? They're still invested in a Zionist framework. And this is where the unlearning Zionism for me becomes a commitment, right? This is how you start. right? There's no, you can't get in and propose an idea without dismantling a certain kind of architecture that always posits the Israeli Jew as the victim, and then is able to neutralize any critique by saying, yeah, these are the bad Zionists, these are the extreme Zionists. No, Zionism itself is extreme. The idea of a greater Israel is extreme. And this is reflective of the Israeli population, right? Israel is constantly polled, right? They say this is the most polled nation in the world. But most people, the majority of Israelis, are comfortable with a greater Israel, not because they'll explicitly said we want Palestinians to starve to death. It's a security matter. So, when you formulate it as a security, you get, I'm protecting my family. That's why I believe in a greater Israel, right? So, but if your security is premised on the insecurity of Palestinians, it's a violation of law. It's an unjust vision of the world. And we can't stand for this.
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. In another one of your essays from March of this year, titled Fascism from the Standpoint of Its Racialized Victims, you write of fascist states the following. Fascist states craft their nation's birth as a moment of jubilation and work to repress any signs of dissent, anything that might induce a crisis of legitimacy. Israel's illiberal 2011 Nakba law attempts to do just that. The Nakba law withholds state funds from cultural and educational institutions that mark the horrors visited on the Palestinian people in 1948. Anything that draws attention to its Zionist colonial beginnings must be thwarted. If you're a Palestinian citizen of Israel, for example, you do not learn about your indigenous culture and history in school. The state denies Palestinian students this right of cultural empowerment. It divorces Palestinians from their past. In Gaza, this approach is taken to a grotesque level through scholasticide. End quote. Now, I am no fan of the recent overuse and hyperbolic misuse of terms like Nazi and fascist, but your use of this term precludes such criticism as you are literally discussing the historical parallels to fascist states, and you lay this claim at the state of Israel. Could you discuss for our listeners who are very sympathetic to Israel and who feel, but the Holocaust, what you're saying, and I've said it too, this idea that there's been a historical guilt around what happened to the Holocaust, so let's just shove them over there. Yet that hasn't seemed to address the problems that we're seeing of, let's say, many British citizens who are Guardian readers who feel guilty for what Zionism has produced, but they don't feel at all bad for what Gazans have had to live through. I'm not saying that every single one is a cohort to genocide, but I do think we have to address the astroturfing of racism through Hasbara, or the propaganda of Israel, was very effective. Because if it could get liberal readers of The Guardian on board, then it succeeded, because that Hasbara was not there for people who went to yeshiva. It was there for people who would be very open to understanding that these people have invaded this Jewish homeland because they were bereft from the very beginning, as we are in the States. We're not taught proper education or history as to Palestine. When I was growing up, the Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat Accords were taking place. And the publicity around that is almost like the royal wedding. And you saw the plane landing and the signatures and Jimmy Carter. But the whole process denied any kind of mention of what was happening at the time in the 60s and 70s, Arab nationalism. Obviously, Nasser's name was never mentioned. And the fact that Menachem Begin was himself a former member of a major terrorist group, right?
Yeah, wanted dead or alive by the British Empire.
Exactly.
Absolutely. No, I mean, these are the questions I constantly struggle with. And I think, readers of The Guardian, readers of the New York Times are starting to contemplate the possibility, right, that Palestinians can be victims of Israel's state. They're starting to see this. I mean, they're starting to acknowledge the victimization of Palestinians. It's hard to completely dismiss the suffering of Palestinians, the genocide of Palestinians. But they can rationalize it away. They can say, yes, but Hamas is ultimately responsible for all this. This started the war. The war started with Hamas. I mean, even Bernie Sanders, right, who's trying to push against Netanyahu, makes Netanyahu the boogeyman. He is the problem, right? And Hamas started it, but Netanyahu took it too far. So it's still the kind of the excess of Israel that is bad. It's not its response. It had a right to response. It had a right to annihilate Palestinians and its civilians as collateral damage. So, if people can see Palestinians as victims, it's a huge thing. People walking, marching for a ceasefire, for Palestinian, anti-Palestinian starvation is something that is positive. At the same time, what I've been arguing is there's a danger in seeing the Palestinians merely as victim, because if you see them merely as victims, you can blame multiple people for their victimization. You can blame Hamas, you can blame the extreme politicians in Israel, but you never really reckon with a settler-colonial framework. And until we reckon with a settler-colonial framework that Palestinians are facing invaders, that narrative has to be, in a sense, naturalized, has to at least be heard at every level. You have to read about this. You have to read about Israel's colonial invasion of Palestine. We have to look at what early Zionists and how they understood their project as a colonial project. I mean, they're on the record because back then colonialism was a good thing, right? Colonialism suggested we're bringing civilization to the barbarians. People have to learn about this. So I think, part of the unlearning here is unlearning Zionism is to learn about Jewish history. How did it end up in Israel, in Palestine? What were the many conflicts happening? And how, once, Israel was forged as a nation, and then especially after 67, this huge rallying behind Israel were historical moments that we forget about, that we always assume, yes, all the Jews always identified with Israel. No, never. I mean, this was never the case. You always had resistance to the Israeli state from Jews and beyond. So for me, is how do you move from seeing Palestinians merely as abject victims and start seeing them as people engaged against an occupier, an illegal occupier? And here the question would be, what can the world do to exert pressure on Israel, right? So you don't demonize BDS. In the unlearning Zionism piece, Europe's recognition, like Macron's recognition of Palestinian statehood, is meaningless. Go after the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. You want to help Palestinians? Change the framework of what constitutes anti-Semitism, because it is still a world-canceling charge. I mean, it's hard to imagine anything worse than being labeled anti-Semitic. So this weaponization of the charge has been devastating, but it's reaching its absurd level, right? Okay, so Hamas is anti-Semitic. People who support Palestine are anti-Semitic. The UN is anti-Semitic. Jewish Voice for Peace is anti-Semitic. Médecins Sans Frontières is anti-Semitic. Everybody's anti-Semitic. I mean, this is a kind of Jewish plot in reverse. I mean, at some time, it is going to lose currency. But how many Palestinians have to die before it loses currency? I mean,
Well, if you take the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism and compare it to Trump's comments yesterday, did you see that? He broke almost all of them
yeah.
when he was referring to his backers. He broke all the rules, and he was not called out for it, of course, because I guess one would classify that as positive racism.
I mean, exactly. And this is the kind of bankruptcy of any kind of group that is devoted, like the ADL, devoted to fighting anti-Semitism, become an instrument of anti-Semitism by aligning themselves with anti-Semitic forces. I mean, this anti-Semitism supporting Israel has a long history. I mean, a lot of European anti-Semites love the idea of Jews being out of Europe, right? If they're somewhere in the Middle East and they can be helpful for geopolitical reasons, that's a double positive, right? And you know, just the very idea of generalizing, like Israel speaks for all Jews, and that itself is an anti-Semitic gesture, right? Because you're generalizing, you're abstracting, all Jews are this. So things things to avoid, all Jews are. That formulation should be dropped. But Zionists use that all the time, all the time.
And it seems that the world has seen. We've seen that there are two measuring sticks: one for the West, one for the global
Yeah,
South.
yeah,
And in
yeah,
fact, your criticism of the failure of people to understand what fascism means today, you note within the same article from March, you ask how to place the liberal position of Americans who are complicit with these fascist politics and understanding of solidarity movements historically. You ask, I'm quoting you, how does fascism become operative in political regimes not readily understood as fascist? How might we interrogate the liberal position in the US in relation to its complicity with and enabling of fascist politics? And how might we imagine anti-fascist resistance? The anti-Zionism of the pro-Palestine activists didn't sit well with the liberal center. America's liberal political class and media outlets have all embraced the same talking points as the Israeli state, denouncing the students' protests and encampments as anti-Semitic, as endangering the lives of Jews all around the world. And I would add to what you've written in March, to the hyperbole of what we've seen since the attack in Manchester 10 days ago, that now we're all supposed to assume and believe that Jews are living in fear all over the UK. How about this? What about the proposition, and I know I'm going to get hate for saying this, what about the proposition that live streaming a genocide for 2+ years might result in anti-Semitism because not us, but you, State of Israel, you, Bibi Netanyahu,
yeah,
are pasting
yeah,
with crazy glue the notion of Zionism to Judaism. That is going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy and nightmare because people are growing angry. People are actually becoming quite weary of seeing this day and night.
yeah,
I
yeah,
cannot watch the videos of children. I just can't. It's too much. And so people are living this, and we are supposed to sit tight with the moniker of you're an anti-Semite. I laugh at it now, okay? I do. People are, yes, I'm an anti-Semite. I LOL it on the social media
yeah,
outlets. And I say, what's really troubling is you call me anti-human and all these other nice words, but you are basically helping the astroturfing of a genocide. Let's talk
yeah,
about that. And of course, they can never answer. And of course, the accounts have 3 followers. And then now with the most recent news of Hasbara being, in fact, funded quite well by the Israeli government in the recent journalistic research over the last 2 weeks. And we even had one of those journalists on the show last week who spoke at length about his research into this. This was Nick Cleveland Stout, who talked about the fact that Israel is paying anywhere from 6,200, I believe, up just over 7,000 per social media post. You see the people who last year seemed reasonable and now seem a bit Zionist crazy in their postings. What happened? So what are your thoughts about the social media buyout? And also there's a bit of irony in this because according to the IHRA, you're not allowed to say things like Jews are owning the media yet.
Yeah.
Zionists have bought, I believe the last figure I read, Zionists have just recently bought, with that latest buyout, 60% of American media. Self-fulfilling prophecy, truth, coincidence, but can we speak about it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the investments. I mean, even Barry Weiss now being elevated to run the news at CBS should alarm all of us. You know, that this kind of pro-Zionist vision, but couch as we're open to all ideas, kind of things. Kind of dissatisfaction with the liberal position, and I think I'll get to that. I mean, what I want to say here, look at in the UK, the anti-migrant march that got a lot of attention. You know, some of the flags that were being waved were the Israeli flag. So I think it tells us quite a bit how fascists are in love with Israel. They want to do to migrants what Israel is doing to Palestinians. So that should give us pause, right? Who's reading Israel favorably? Fascists are, European fascists. So for me, in the US, in the context of the US, the liberal position on Black Lives Matter has been abysmal, right? They've tried to harness Black rage for elections, and Biden beat Trump precisely because of the anger from voters, from activists. But then he did nothing. And he did worse than nothing. He actually argued that we don't need to defund the police, we need to fund the police more. So complete betrayal of the activists for Black Lives, for the kind of global movement that BLM re-sparked again after George Floyd's death, murder. So, I always trace the white liberals' position vis-a-vis Black rage and Black suffering. That they say, yeah, of course we should teach critical race theory. Of course we should talk about slavery, but it's always contained, right? In a sense, what Frank Wilderson calls, they want responsible rage. They don't want irresponsible rage. They don't want the excess of Black frustration to emerge, right? So protest, but protest without breaking property, without trashing cars and burning buildings. So do it nicely. I think and then they're split. The liberal elite will say, yeah, we're for Black Lives Matter. The Republicans always hated Black Lives Matter, right? Trump called them thugs and so forth. What the Palestinian solidarity movement revealed is how fake the liberal position actually is on questions of racial justice. They only pay lip service to racial justice. So with Palestine, they showed their cards. They're as invested in law and order as Republicans, right? In essence, both parties are very much invested in the status quo. So that's why I read the solidarity movement for Palestine as a repetition of Black Lives Matter. And the repetition here has to be understood in a kind of psychoanalytic fashion. It speaks to a problem. It rots in society. So it returns in the face of Palestinians resisting, with the full support of many of the kind of Black Lives Matter chapters. I mean, who were the first to stand with Palestinians in the backlash to October 7th? It was BLM chapters, it was Red Nation. They stood with Palestinians because they understood that their violence is actually a counter violence that is only read as violence, right, from mainstream media, right? And then we talk about the self-defense of Israel, right? We never understand Israel as committing the originary violence.
That's the problem here, because you have all these people on Twitter. Today, I had someone with a Bible verse name. I'm not joking. It was Ezekiel. I forgot the rest of it, arguing with me. And I don't, I've learned years ago that Twitter is, you're not going to convert anyone to seeing, even convincing them to go to the library and read an article or get a book out.
Yeah.
I found it very interesting that people are still going back to and this year and that year. And so I went through the census last year and I posted a few factoids about the census of Jewish versus Palestinian population at the turn of the century. I followed that up a few more decades on. And I said, even this shouldn't matter, because what should matter and what we should be talking about is, how about the 700,000 Palestinians who were displaced upon the formation of the state of Israel? Discuss, we're not talking about that. And that is just a fact. And they were displaced in a cruel manner into IDP camps. There are photos. You can see it on the UN website. They have myriad photos of this. Now, why this has never figured in historically, I think, is a no-brainer. And follow me, if you will, on this. Because, we got Edward Said, his Orientalism, Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak? We had post-colonial studies that when I was in graduate school, I benefited from. And I was very lucky to have been doing my graduate degrees in New York City. And I was even luckier at 1 year, the first Edward Said conference, I was one of the speakers. And I was like, what am I doing on this poster? Because everyone on the poster was uber famous. And then there was me and Todd Porterfield, who I think he's returned now to New York, maybe Princeton even. And we later became colleagues in Montreal at the Université de Montréal. And we were the only two people who were not world renowned on the poster. That was the first Edward Said conference. It was fascinating to me to see how Edward Said's work formed a huge part of what we would call in the States liberal education. I know the right-wingers don't like this. It's notable that when I go to India, and I've been interviewed for positions there, turned down jobs there at many private institutions that have been formed on the basis of science, technology, dentistry, medicine, no humanities. There's a pushback to humanities that's happening across many parts of Asia, and it's coming to the States. It's been coming to also Great Britain. I'm worried about this because the heritage of liberal education, of philosophy, of history is important, because we are seeing what happens when you don't have it. People negating the Nakba, people pretending that Israel was always there because someone pointed out a Bible passage, and I'm like, dude, look at the United Nations. Let's talk about history. I become very alarmed when, on the one hand, one of our writers today was in the court for terrorism charges because she was one of the first 19 who showed up the day that the High Court ruled that Palestine Action was a terrorist group. And she was arrested. She held up a pacifist sign. And since the arrests of those first 19, hundreds of others have been arrested. The British government is in a pickle, especially with a Labour leader who doesn't look very Labour and not very much like a leader. And we're in this quagmire of having to understand what human rights means when we've got a plethora of information at our keyboards, at our mobile phones. No one seems to care about facts on the one hand. The genocide in the middle, it's right there. We're all watching it. And then on the other hand, we are very aware of the Hasbara manipulation of data, of buying up social media posts. And Netanyahu said it himself the other week. We have to confront the battlefield. The new battlefield is no longer with bombs. It's now social media. He knew it. He's not dumb.
Yeah.
So he's buying up the opinion that is tanking his own reputation, even at home, as you pointed out earlier. What do we do in a world where the fact of 700,000 Palestinians kicked out of their homeland is somehow anathema to mention by the very same people that you just mentioned? This, that all the Black Lives Matter people, a lot of them were maybe the week before at a protest for indigenous rights.
Yeah.
People would not support this in middle America, even with indigenous Americans being kicked off their land, 700,000 people being thrown off. Yet when 1948 happened, we did not yet have the full force of post-colonial efforts or decolonizing efforts. We had wars being fought against the French in North Africa.
Yeah.
But I think that that was a hiccup in history where people say, well, all these countries decolonized, but Palestine was just sort of left, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's anachronistic, the fact you would have a colonial state emerge in 48 when everything else was decolonizing. It's an exception. I mean, it's an early sign of Israel exceptionality. I mean, there's a lot there. The protesters, our students, people who are fighting for Palestinians, are pointing desperately to the problem of genocide. But in pointing to the problem of genocide, in a sense, they become the problem for the law, for the state, for the government, which is outrageous, right? Every single activist is enacting what Said preached, a kind of humanistic understanding of others, especially non-Europeans, as a counter to Orientalism. So I'm completely with you, right? I mean, the project of narrating the Palestinian narrative, right? The permission to narrate that Said fought so hard for. And, you can look back and see statements that he made and the disappointments in what has happened since. So, he thought that the 82 Israeli invasion of Lebanon was a turning point for the West. Like the West could actually see ample evidence that this is a war of choice, no longer a war of necessity. Because I think propaganda had made it clear that 67 was Israel's self-defense. For the mainstream narrative that dominated. 82, I mean, even Reagan told, Menachem Begin, stop your genocide. Sorry, stop your Holocaust. And then Menachem Begin objected, President Reagan, I'm very well aware of Holocaust. So, but it didn't change. Still, Israel recovered, right? I mean, you had that horrible interview with Emmanuel Levinas after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, where his interviewer was asking him, isn't the Palestinian the other of the Israeli? And he said, no, 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 no. My vision of the other is much more philosophical, blah, blah, blah. And during the conversation, he was able to, so both Levinas and Finkelkraut was the other interviewee, were saying, look at the 300,000 protests in Tel Aviv against Menachem Begin government and Ariel Sharon, who was, running the Lebanon at the time, the invasion. They were pointing to an ethical Zionism against pushing back against Menachem Begin's political Zionism. So that's these are the kind of moments of Zionisms in the plural. Where, oh yes, ethical Zionism still gives life to the idea of Israel. Where are the 300,000 Israeli Jews protesting against the killing of Palestinians? They're non-existent. They're not there, right? They're not there in mass. There are pockets of leftist, activists in Israel. Absolutely, they exist. We have refuseniks, people who refuse to serve in the Israeli military, but they don't get coverage. People don't care. Mainstream media doesn't want to deal with them, right? Because they're interruptions to their narrative. So, I mean, going back to the Nakba here, and this is a point that Nadia Abu al-Hajj has made very powerfully. We have a weird reality here because Palestinians have started to narrate their Nakba. I mean, I think, people understand it, but the belief that if you hear the story, you'll be convinced about the Palestinian cause hasn't played out. We have weird realities now. So, the Nakba law was enacted, there's always the fear of recognizing the colonial past. But in a perverse way, what the genocide has made people comfortable, like Israeli politicians, to call for a new Nakba, Nakba 2.0, to finish the Nakba. So they're no longer running away from ethnic cleansing, they want to finish it. So how do you produce a counter narrative to that? And for me, the only way you can do that is by stress the anti-colonial framework of settler-colonialism to push back against this joy of the Nakba now from the extreme right and actually call out the liberals as it's clear, you have to choose. Do you join the model of a greater Israel or do you fight for justice on this land? And I think liberals on the whole in Israel have shifted with the rights, with the ultra nationalists. And Eva Illouz is one of like my perfect example of that move. Somebody who showed, who talked about the occupation as a problem. Because, if you're a liberal Zionist, 67 is the problem. It's never 48. So, you talk about the occupation, and, she was one of the signatories of this open letter about the elephant in the room, which is the occupation. Like the Israeli government has to deal with the occupation. I think the bigger elephant in the room is settler-colonialism and the refusal to counter that. And for me, that's where I think Said is needed more than ever, because he started thinking about Palestine as a settler colonial project.
Yes, and when I did work on the second Intifada with the first 5 female suicide bombers, obviously not them, they were dead, but their families and the communities that formed around them, I did a lot of work with the refuseniks, Makhsam Waqt. Those were generally mothers and grandmothers who stayed at Makhsam, the roadblocks, to observe and intervene and help. Amazing forces.
Yeah.
The parent circle, wonderful parents, again, on both sides, who had lost children to suicide bombers, mostly. Not always, but often. There were inroads being made there. But the Israelis do not represent the majority, which is heartbreaking for me. And I think it's heartbreaking for Israelis of our mindset as well. And the thing that I realized, though, every day I lived in the Armenian quarter. I would go to Ramallah, and then I was using the transport as other Palestinians. So I'd be going to projects that I was working on, Bethlehem, Hebron. But every day I would go to Ramallah, I would witness acts of racism constantly. And I grew up in the Deep South. I grew up from the age of 10 in Louisiana and Mississippi. I've seen racism. My father is not white. I've seen a lot of racism. When I came back from the West Bank in Israel and I came back to Montreal, I told friends, I said, I think I need to go back into psychoanalysis. This was the most harsh shit that I've ever seen in my life. Excuse my language, but I would witness at 1800 hours at a certain part of Jerusalem, there's a staircase that ascends, and old women with large boxes upon which would sit grape leaves, and young IDF soldiers, they were literally 18, 19, 20, would come, kick them over because they were 30 seconds over the deadline to collect that and go home. And I witnessed this daily. How I had to translate this to myself so that it didn't interfere with my research was also hard. I was meeting people who had just built their first home, psychiatrists. I was supposed to meet her at her home to interview her. Couldn't, because her home had been blown up by the IDF. And it beggars belief, all the stories that I was collecting by pure accident. And oftentimes I made a film, I put that out on Twitter several times over the past 2 years, that show what it's like to take a 15-minute trip for Israelis, a 15-minute trip on Egged buses or a private car on their private roads. People do not realize there's a complete apartheid system in the West Bank. And I would take the Palestinian transport, right? The taxis. That sounds fancy. It's not. You get stopped every so many minutes by a broken building that you have to walk through the rubble. That's the Makhsam. And you have to take 4-5 hours to what Israelis travel in 15 minutes. This is not just a state that has bad people they want to get rid of. This is what we're told in our media, but that's not what this is about. When 9/11 happened, another book project I worked on was, in fact, in Brooklyn, Avenue H, Coney Island Avenue, where I worked with the Muslim community there, who in the aftermath of 9/11 were disappeared. Men were disappeared. 14,000 men were disappeared because of special registration in the United States. Grotesque. But what I noted to David Miller the other day, and I think it's worth mentioning since you are in the States, is that the U.S. copied and pasted Israeli politics around this. They took the same exact approach that men under, I believe it was 35, had to special register, be interviewed by INS, and men were secretly deported, put on planes, families didn't know where they were. And so I have serious problems with the way in which Israeli ideology has permeated American politics, including international politics, such that there's no such thing as an innocent Muslim man And the other day, some complete stranger wrote me on Facebook and we had a chat. He's a young Egyptian professional and he saw the feminists freaking out on my wall because I said, to date, there is no confirmation, including the Israeli police say they have not had victims coming forward saying she had been raped on 7 October. Not saying it didn't happen, saying the facts. And he said, well, these women think that we're all, excuse the language, goat fuckers. And I said, pretty much, because the racism, even before I went to the Arab world the first time, I went to Morocco. One of my colleagues in my department, I was in a comparative literature department at CUNY Graduate Center, she said to me, oh, you better be careful. And I got the spiel. I was really shocked because, you don't know someone thinks like this until you realize it. I have to say that much of what we're seeing is pure ignorance.
Sure.
And I always tell people, I said, study some Arabic, go. Come back and let's talk.
I mean, it is the Arab imago, right? The Palestinian imago. This is how it haunts your cultural collective unconscious. I think, people just accept these images and then they inform their vision of the world. So you're predisposed to see Palestinians as rapists, as dangerous beings that just want to do harm, right? Because they're intrinsically this way. And how do you dislodge Palestinian, the Arab imago, the Palestinian imago as terrorists, rapists? It takes that kind of unlearning that Said was trying to think through Orientalism. How do you unlearn Orientalism? How do you dismantle the mechanisms that create your perception of the world, right? Between lives that matter, lives that don't matter, lives that should be feared, lives that should be loved. For me, in my work in political Black studies, I'm thinking about the IOF soldier that you described knocking off the stuff of the Palestinian women, holding it together. There's a kind of libidinal kick. There's a sadistic enjoyment of humiliating Palestinians. I think this is baked in Israeli culture, right? It feels good, right, to demean Palestinians because it serves as a kind of solidarity among Jews. It brings people together. Where, a lot of the Mizrahi Jews are living in the settlements because they can't afford living in Tel Aviv, right? So there's a lot of economic hardship, but then that's sold as a solution, guaranteed loans for, to go live in the settlements, illegal settlements. So there's a kind of, economic interest is negated by this kind of libidinal kick. What Du Bois talks about, the wage of whiteness, the psychological wage of whiteness. I think we have that experience in the context of Israel. Jewishness has a wage, right? The way Zionism weaponizes this wage is an attempt to demonize Palestinians. You might be suffering. They may hate you if you're an Ethiopian Jew, but you're better off than Palestinians. That's built in, and it's very hard to crack to create solidarity movements within Israel.
The irony here, of course, is that it becomes a class issue fundamentally. It's not a feminist issue. It's class because Israel is weaponizing the poorest of its poor to fight the battles that many of these people might not otherwise wish to fight. I don't want to speak for them. Every Friday, I had a habit of going to the Wailing Wall.
Yeah.
I would go and get picked up for dinner, and I'd go and talk I did it. I can't tell you how many Shabbat dinners I was kicked out of, but not all. And dialogue is possible. And at first they said, what are you doing? And I had to edge around the fact of I was interviewing families of suicide bombers that day. We have to have these dialogues in as much as they're uncomfortable. And I think what was most interesting to me when I spoke to these people, they had no clue what was happening 5 kilometers from their home in Jerusalem. Not a clue. They believe their own propaganda.
So this is where, there's willful ignorance here. At some level, you have to take some responsibility for what is happening in Palestine. This kind of willful ignorance reaches its limits. Césaire also kind of warned, you cannot colonize innocently. Yeah, in a sense, You should know what your government is doing over there. I mean, you're on the streets protesting for a release of the hostages. Good for you. But aren't you aware what they're doing to Palestinians? Shouldn't that be a concern as well? I mean, Israel is going to be known as this, generation génocidaire. How are they going to live? How are they going to live with this?
There was a protest last week, and I was very impressed by them because they were not the ones out there. And I'm not criticizing. I mean, I would be out there if my family had been kidnapped. I understand those people. But the masses of the protests have been about discontent with Netanyahu and what he did to the Constitution. Okay. But very few protests like this youth, and they were all under 20 pretty much, but they were really angry. And the reason why I think there's hope, at least amongst that demographic, is because those are the ones serving in the IDF who, I mean, we do have the refuseniks. Some are my age. I mean, there's quite a few refuseniks, which, as you said, have been snuffed out of media representation. But I think that the younger generation is hearing the voices around the planet, and they're not happy at all that they're being asked to commit war crimes. Let's start there. You've got Oliver Stone, who made one of his films was about people resisting committing war crimes in Vietnam, but somehow it's a war crime there, but not in Israel. And I think what we're going to start hearing more from are these soldiers. And it happened. If you saw the media footage a couple of weeks ago, IDF soldiers, they went into Knesset and they threw down all the drugs that they had, saying, this is what we have to take to survive this. And they talked about the suicides.
Absolutely. I was going to mention that. Absolutely. I mean, but we almost get the idea of war traumatizes the victimizer as well. I mean, I think we're seeing this. But I think until Israel is driven by a desire to decolonize itself, right? A desire to actually reckon with its colonial past, not just to get out of the occupied territories, but to push for the right of return, right? The internationally enshrined right of return. The possibility of them giving up on a Jewish Israel, right? Adopting a society which sees everybody as equal. Until they make those demands, I mean, they'll feel bad, right? And they'll feel good about feeling bad. And I think this is still the liberal Zionist position. So we can come back to a liberal Zionist position before the rhetoric. I'm sure you've heard of this rhetoric of how liberal Zionists have sobered up after October 7th. And they're mad at the global left, the anti-colonial left, for not standing with them. So we can imagine, maybe a few years, 10 years down the line, we'll be back to an earlier liberal Zionist position. But the earlier Zionist position made precisely the description of the checkpoints possible. They didn't want to deal with this. That's somebody else's problem, right? As long as they're not killing us, we'll let the checkpoints just drain the life out of Palestinians slowly.
Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel like Fanon is more relevant than ever here because he, for those who do not know, was a Martinican psychiatrist and philosopher, brilliant writer, who described racism in his work in Algeria as a doctor treating French soldiers. He described racism as a mental illness, arguing that colonialism inflicts psychological trauma upon the subject who is in fact enacting racist and horrific acts. But this, he talks about that it leads to alienation and various neuroses. In his Black Skin, White Masks, he delineates this most clearly. We're seeing this amongst Israelis, not just the soldiers and the refuseniks, them especially. What I liked about the UN the other week was not the declaration of Palestinian statehood, because that to me...
People leaving the room.
Exactly. I screamed. I'm
completely with you. I'm completely with you on that point.
That symbolic force. It wasn't about Netanyahu goes home and has his feelings hurt. No. It was the Israeli people will see what the world population thinks of their leader. And they have to sit with that.
Yeah, and they have to sit with the polls where they're supporting the genocide. I mean, I think there's no alternative to Netanyahu vis-a-vis the Palestinians. There's an alternative to Netanyahu vis-a-vis who gets to define Jewishness, which is what the judicial coup was all about. You have, the push from the extreme wing, religious wing of his coalition, wanting to redefine what constitutes Jewishness. So it scared a lot of the secular Jews around the world. What is Israel doing? And that provoked all these marches, to stop Netanyahu. But on the level of Palestine, there's no real oppositional party that says anything different. They all voted against recognizing Palestinian statehood, right? The majority of the Senate is against Palestinian statehood. So Netanyahu is not alone there. Until that changes, until people demand, like, we want leaders who will strike peace with the Palestinians, who will dismantle the illegal settlements, who will pay reparation for the Palestinian suffering, who found maybe a truth and reconciliation framework. But this has to come out. Not, feeling bad about it, maybe eventually, is not going to deal anywhere close to the injustices done to the Palestinians.